Hello, my name is Sarah Taylor. I am a project manager for Spectrum Advantage, which is a program that helps get people on the autism spectrum employed. I also do some HR consulting for companies that are looking to accommodate their employees on the autism spectrum. I am going to be talking today about innovative practices for helping people on the autism spectrum get hired and stay employed. So, what do you know about autism spectrum disorder? I may refer to it as ASD, but autism spectrum disorders, I find that a lot of the times your first story of autism may be the story that you gravitate towards. A lot of the times I hear people talk about the story of Rain Man. Seeing that movie might have been their first exposure to the idea of what an autism spectrum disorder is. If you'll remember, Rain Man was a movie that was released in the early 90s. Dustin Hoffman had a brilliant portrayal of a special needs individual. It was an individual who lived on the autism spectrum, and a lot of those stereotypes maybe stand until this day. There are other stories of people in popular culture who lived on the autism spectrum, people like Albert Einstein. At the time that he died, he was still unable to tie his shoes. That might be an indicator that he lived on the autism spectrum. Mozart, who was a child prodigy. Andy Warhol. Even people who are involved in popular culture today, like Daryl Hannah and Dan Aykroyd, have disclosed that they live on the autism spectrum. So what is an autism spectrum disorder? There's a phrase coined by Dr. Stephen Shore. He himself lives on the autism spectrum, and he says, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. Really, really profound statement, because our first story of autism may not be the only story of autism. Really, autism is a spectrum disorder, which means it presents very differently in different people. What we do know about it is that there is a shared core of traits. And so that might look like communication deficits. In one person, that might look like they're not able to have a conversation at all. In another person, it might mean like they're not able to modulate a conversation. So they're not able to know when it's their turn to speak versus your turn to speak. The other parts of those shared core of traits are the social difficulties. A lot of people on the autism spectrum, all people on the autism spectrum, struggle with social norms, understanding social information, and how they process that. And then we might also see sensory difficulties. There is no definitive test for autism, and what we do know is that presently 1 in 68 children in North America have been identified with an autism spectrum disorder. 5 times more common in boys than in girls. So we're looking at 1 in 42 boys and maybe 1 in 189 girls. That is significant, and we know that those numbers are growing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. Some of the associated characteristics with autism spectrum disorders are abnormalities of mood. So maybe mood changes for reasons that we can't identify. An uneven profile of skill development, and a strong preference for routine. Those are things that we see in a lot of people who are on the autism spectrum disorder. When I talk about that uneven profile of skill development, I often think of that scene in the movie Rain Man where Dustin Hoffman completely freaks out when it's time to get on the airplane. He is unable to cope with that expectation, but he does have some really special skills. So there is a scene in the movie where number of toothpicks fall on the floor, and he is able to identify just from sound exactly how many toothpicks fall on the floor. So it's a really special skill, but not necessarily an employable skill. We also see a lot of the times with autism spectrum disorders, unusual fears, unusual anxieties. Autism and employment is really what I want to talk about today. What makes autism and employment any different than any other disability? It's interesting because employment and disability, here are some recent Canadian stats. I think they're from 2011. And it really really looks at how employment looks for people with disabilities. You'll see that the numbers for disability and employment are not that seriously impacted. They are impacted, and of course, we look at impairment severity and how that affects employment, and the more severe the disability is, the less likely people are to find employment. But when we look at autism in employment, we see that there is a significant change. These are American stats. There are no Canadian stats on autism specifically in disability and employment. But these American stats show from 2013 that when you look at regular disability and unemployment, there's about a 15% gap. When you look at autism and unemployment, there's about an 85% gap. So that's even when we're impairing for severity of disability and other factors. Seems like it is much harder to really look at employing people on the autism spectrum. The question is, what's so different about autism spectrum disorder? Why is it so much harder to employ people on the autism spectrum, even very high functioning people, than it is to employ people with other disabilities? A lot of the people that I work with in my day-to-day are people who are very well educated, people who have master's degrees, people who have PhDs, but they struggle either to get employment or to maintain employment. Why is it so different? There are huge barriers in the workplace, particularly in today's workplace, that really set up a challenging environment that are specific to people on the autism spectrum. Number one is that workplace cultural shift. The workplace is a very social place. 30 years ago, you could get employed and you could stay employed just on the strength of your skills. If you did your job well, went to your office every day, talked to nobody, but did a good job, you could keep your job. In today's workplace, there is an absolute cultural shift. We're looking for the social fit. People are dismissed for reasons that they are not the right fit for the team. They're dismissed because they are not getting along with coworkers, whereas 35 years ago, that maybe wasn't something that we had to worry about. When you look at some of the hiring practices that take place now, there are things called behavioral scenario questions, which for a lot of people are very powerful. For HR companies, they might serve to weed out people who are difficult or have a difficult time developing a plan of action. A lot of people on the autism spectrum who are very concrete may have a lot of difficulty answering questions like that, may not understand the social implications of answering those types of questions. I have on this slide this question: if you were a fruit, what would you be and why? A lot of the times those are questions that are asked in interviews. They're fun questions. They help us see if people can adapt. For somebody on the autism spectrum who is very literal, answering this type of question might be the difference between being able to get a job and not being able to get a job. Also, the challenge is fitting in. Fitting in with the social culture around us is really important. We all like to work with people who make us feel comfortable. Somebody on the autism spectrum may not have a lot of insight about what makes the people around them feel comfortable. They may have challenges fitting in. They may not understand that if I don't want to go to a social environment because it's too loud and noisy, that makes it look like I'm unfriendly and not wanting to be friends with the people on my team. So things like fitting in with the team are really impactful for people on the autism spectrum and their ability to get employment. Also, those challenges communicating effectively make it really challenging for people on the autism spectrum to get employed and to stay employed. So of course, we're dealing with high functioning people on the autism spectrum. Their challenges in communicating might not deal with the ability to talk. It might deal more with the ability to understand what's being said. So I have everybody's favorite Aspie, Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. He makes this statement, a response to this statement, love is in the air. He says, wrong. Nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide are in the air. So again, that very literal understanding of statements. I can think back to years ago when I worked with children on the autism spectrum and having to teach the meaning of idioms specifically. So we would have kids who heard a statement like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, and they would run outside and literally look for cats and dogs to fall from the air. Now, if you're not understanding sort of idioms, sarcasm, those sorts of things, it can be really difficult to fit in. You cannot understand when people are joking. You cannot understand things that are happening around you in the office. And so that effective communication is a huge impacting factor. We also look at behavior challenges. So a lot of people on the autism spectrum, a lot of things that actually deal with communication challenges may look like behavior challenges. So wanting to state your point over and over again, wanting to make sure, sending an email. I've seen people who send emails to multiple people after a meeting just to get their point in one last time. That might seem like a behavioral challenge, but for the person on the spectrum, it might really be represented by their communication challenges. In this particular slide, you can see a man writing suggestions, tons and tons and tons of suggestions, and he's being seen as a troublemaker rather than somebody who's trying to be helpful. So again, it's that concrete and literal understanding that sometimes stands in the way of being able to fit in the team. I always think it's not fair to talk about challenges without talking about the assets and without talking about the benefits. And so I want to talk about some of the assets that autism has in the workplace. Things like that precision and attention to detail are things that we see very much for people on the autism spectrum, that organization. I remember when we first set up, and myself and my team first set up this employment program in the Calgary area for people on the autism spectrum, that one of the people commented like, "Oh, what do we do about lates? What do we do about people who don't show up?" And I said, "Oh, you clearly haven't had a lot of experience with this population, because going in the first day of class and all throughout classes, one of the things that we see consistently is that our people are there a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour before the class starts. They are waiting outside. In fact, they may make people uncomfortable with how prompt they are rather than being late. So we chronically see people on the autism spectrum tend to really, really, really value being on time, being precise, over delivering. Some of the social assets of not really understanding a lot of the communication that takes place around you is that we don't have a lot of gossip. We don't have a lot of those social distractions that tend to happen in the neurotypical population. We don't really see those with people on the autism spectrum. If you don't understand the social hierarchy of the workplace, chances are you're not going to worry about gossiping. You're not going to worry about who is doing what. Those types of distractions really aren't factors for people on the autism spectrum. A lot of the time you're dealing with people who put their heads down, get their work done, and that is their number one priority. They follow the rules. Another asset in terms of communication is the level of honesty that we tend to see with people on the autism spectrum. If you're very concrete, a lot of people on the spectrum, the thought of lying is so wrong and so off for them that you'll find that they are extremely, extremely honest. And that works as an asset in the workplace. You are not going to have a lot of those double-ended meanings. You're not going to have people who you can't trust. You are going to have a very honest employee. So those are some of the assets. I want to talk a little bit about the strategies for supporting people on the autism spectrum. And there are some general strategies, and then I'm going to move into some more specific strategies. Number one, general strategy, set clear expectations. Be really clear about what you want. Try to avoid sarcasm. Try to avoid some of those meanings. I want to say some of the discussion that may be very non-literal. So be specific about what you need. I can think of one very educated individual who I was working with who had a meeting with his boss and gave me a call afterward, really quite upset because his boss had said to the team that he needs everybody to pull up their socks. And he called me, and his socks weren't very long socks, and he was quite concerned because he wasn't sure how he would be able to pull up his socks in order to perform to the boss's specifications. So avoiding language like pull up your socks and being specific, like we need you to work better, we need you to work smarter, we need you to work more effectively, might be a more powerful tool for a person on the autism spectrum. Be concrete about what you need. Break down instructions step by step, and I'll give some examples of that later on, but give instructions in visual forms. Having instructions posted on the wall might be really, really powerful for an employee on the autism spectrum. And also do your best to learn what to find out what their learning style is. You can ask. Other general strategies for supporting people on the autism spectrum are to provide warning for changes. So really provide that clarity around what's going to happen, what's expected, what's going on, giving very clear feedback. I feel like that is invaluable. One of the things that happens in the North American workplace is that we are very PC, and I understand the reasons for that, but for the purposes of somebody who maybe doesn't understand a lot of social context, it's really challenging to not receive clear feedback. The clearer you can be, the better the performance from the individual on the autism spectrum. So and that's something that I find a lot of HR managers really struggle with, and something that really we need to remind people of a lot. Ask the individual what they need. A person on the autism spectrum always has a lot of insight into what they need to be successful. So asking those questions really can be a very powerful tool in setting people up for success. Moving into more specific tools to support individuals on the autism spectrum, you might want to look at helping them with their job search specifics. So I'm going to talk first about tools to help them find jobs, and then specific tools to help them keep jobs. So really being specific about those job searches. A lot of the time we'll find that people on the autism spectrum either throw a very broad net and apply for every single thing that they see, whether or not they're qualified, or they have a very, very narrow net. And if they don't have every single qualification on the list, they will not apply. So really helping them with some of those job search specifics, helping them to be different around the words that they're using to indicate a job title is very, very powerful in helping a person on the autism spectrum find jobs. Helping them with some interview skills. We're going to talk a little more specifically about that, but interview skills are a number one killer for people on the autism spectrum and their ability to find employment. So we're going to talk about how you can help people on the autism spectrum with their interview skills. I also want to talk a little bit about self-advocacy. I think it's really important to empower people to be their own advocates. And one of the things that we find with people on the autism spectrum, particularly people who have received a lot of services in the past, is that they may sit passively back and wait for other people to do a lot of work. The more you can empower people to be their own advocates, is the more successful they can be moving forward. And the last thing that I'll talk about in terms of specific tools is disclosure. How to disclose, when to disclose, and just some specific strategies and tools. So in terms of job searching tools, resume checking over that resume. Recently read a resume, and in the objectives portion, it said, my objective is to provide a snapshot for the person reading this resume. You might want to be a little more general in how you define your objective. So really reading over those resumes. Again, if somebody has a very literal understanding of things, that may be reflected in their resume. So check over the resume of the person on the autism spectrum. Again, I see a lot of the extremely specific, where they have a 2-page description of their job and their job skills, or the not specific enough, where there's a 1 line and it doesn't provide any insight into the work that they've done in the past. So reading over those resumes carefully. Individualized relevant cover letter. Again, a lot of those broad cover letters, so one cover letter that's sent to every single job that may outline skills that are not specific to that job. Helping that person customize the cover letter to that position may be very, very powerful. Providing checklist, a resume checklist, a cover letter checklist, an interview checklist. These are the types of tools that are really, really powerful for a person on the autism spectrum. Might remind them of all of the things to do in the moments before they seek a job or go into an interview. Setting up a job search calendar. So a lot of people who are very rule bound, if something's in the calendar, it's a rule. And so setting up a calendar, reminders in your phone, electronic e-reminders is a very, very powerful tool for helping somebody who might not be motivated on their own to look for a job, to do some of the things that are necessary for obtaining a job. Also, a schedule for checking emails. Again, we see the either over-focus on email or under-focus on email for people on the autism spectrum. So a lot of people may send out job resumes and then not look back to check if a response has come. So setting up a schedule of when to check is very important. And also voicemail protocols. How do you answer a voicemail? How do you respond to a call when you get it? Going over creating a script, creating a protocol or a checklist is a very powerful tool for a person on the autism spectrum. A lot of the times the things they say in the moment may stand between them getting that telephone interview or acing that telephone interview and moving forward or being passed over for a job. In terms of setting up individuals on the autism spectrum for interview success, video recording an interview is a very powerful tool to speak to some of the things that nonverbal skills. So a lot of the times I interviewed a young man not long ago. He was on the autism spectrum. He graduated from SAIT, top of his class. He had had 137 interviews in the 2 years since graduation and had never been offered a job position. So I suggested that we have a mock interview, and I video recorded his mock interview. And very early into the mock interview, I understood why he hadn't been offered a job. He spent the entire interview focused down on the table. He hunched into himself. He answered questions, very, very one-word answers. And so it became very clear to me why he could not get that job. In video, being able to review that video footage with the person on the autism spectrum. So again, this might be somebody who doesn't have a lot of perspective on what they look like to other people. The opportunity to be able to watch themselves on tape, the opportunity to be able to speak to some of the nonverbal behaviors. If somebody has what we call stimming behaviors, self-stimulatory behaviors where they bounce their foot a lot or they move awkwardly, being able to see themselves on tape might be a revolutionary thing for that individual. So I find it very powerful to review video footage of mock interviews and really go through answers, set up scripts for commonly asked interview questions. Really, really powerful. So the other thing we want to look at is what I like to call disclosing without disclosing. Disclosing, it means telling your employer that you live on the autism spectrum. And there are times that might serve you, there are times it might not. We'll discuss that a little later. But in an interview, it might really serve you to use this technique that I call self-advocacy, using a self-advocacy script. So that is where you tell your employer that you live on the autism spectrum without actually using those words. And so I have a copy of this worksheet that will be available with this slide. You'll be able to click on a link and get a hold of this worksheet. But it is a self-advocacy script. And it's a way to talk about behavior that may be unavoidable for a person on the autism spectrum without actually saying that they're on the autism spectrum. And so I will use the script. I'm going to talk about something that might happen in the workplace. So, and using the script. So basically, you can use it to say, I am the type of person who gets so focused on their work that sometimes I might forget to look at the person who's talking to me. I'm not trying to ignore you. I'm just the type of person who gets so focused, I stop paying attention. If I'm not looking at you or answering when you're talking to me, it would help me if you would tap me on the shoulder. And this is an extremely powerful tool for a person on the autism spectrum. It's a way for them to talk about things that might look odd to a neurotypical person without saying that they live on the autism spectrum. It's a way to explain behaviors that may seem a little off-putting to people. So you can use it to explain physical behaviors. If it is a motor behavior that you have, if it is that you tap incessantly, it could be, I am the type of person who taps my hand when I think. If it is distracting to you, just tap me on my shoulder and say, could you stop tapping? But it really helps people who are on the autism spectrum give neurotypicals a framework, a lens with which to see their behavior. So it's a really, really powerful tool. I also want to talk about the idea of when it serves to disclose. Another link to this video will be Barbara Bissonnette's disclosure scale. But really thinking about, does it serve you to disclose and at what point it serves you to disclose? I would suggest for a lot of people, it might serve to disclose in an interview if you are somebody who wants to talk not about accommodations that you'll need, because you don't want to go into an interview talking immediately about accommodations. You want to wait and maybe say, use it to explain behaviors that might look odd. So if it is that you have an uncontrollable need to look away or you cannot make eye contact in an interview, you might want to try something like a self-advocacy script. I'm the type of person who has a lot of trouble thinking and looking at a person at the same time. If I'm not looking at you, it's not because I'm trying to ignore you, it's just because I'm really deep in thought. But you also might want to think about how impactful that behavior is. If it's a behavior that's going to keep you from getting the job, then you may want to disclose immediately in the interview. So just saying, please don't be off-put if I do insert the behavior, but I do live on the autism spectrum. So that might be something that you want to do. But have a look at this disclosure scale and see when it serves you to disclose and when it doesn't. In terms of setting individuals on the autism spectrum up for employment success, I also want you to think about being patient during training and breaking instruction down into small segments. Explain how tasks and assignments fit into the whole picture. Again, if you have somebody who is a very concrete thinker, it might really help them to understand how one job or one step is connected to the other steps, and why particular steps or parts of the process are important. So again, you're having people who may struggle with perspective taking. Giving them that perspective may be really, really important in setting them up for success in employment. Again, talking a little bit about checklists. Personal checklists, encouraging a person on the autism spectrum to take ownership of creating checklists that they need in order to be successful is really, really powerful for ongoing success. So again, not so much making a checklist for them, but reminding somebody on the spectrum that if you create a checklist, then you'll have the power, is often really, really powerful. Being clear and concise. So we talked about the idea of giving really direct statements when you're giving feedback. The draft is due in 3 days and should include at least 6 ideas for improving efficiency, as opposed to, or something like 30 entries must be made per hour is going to be very, very powerful and really improve the performance of that person on the autism spectrum. And lastly, I have a little video. This is one of our former program participants, and so I haven't talked a lot about our program, but I do run an employment program called Spectrum Advantage, and Spectrum Advantage really helps prepare people on the autism spectrum for employment. And this particular clip is of one of our graduates. Nick graduated from the program in 2014. He has been successfully employed since that time, continues to be successfully employed. In fact, came to see me not too long ago because he's ready for his next career move. Since going through our program, not only has he maintained his employment, he also went back to school and earned his high school diploma, his GED, and is now ready for the next move in his career. So I will share this story with you.
My job is to help anyone on the sales floor who's looking for assistance with printers, computers, just finding ink. Anything they need help with in that area, I'm there to give them a hand. It's one of the best feelings ever when you help a customer and they say something like, "Thank you so much, Nick." They shake your hand.
So Nick, this is a direct pull down. So
Nick was very genuine and very polite when we first met.
if you have any questions, just let me know.
Okay?
Okay?
He was inquisitive. He wanted to know what the expectations were going to be for himself.
Autism, it made life in school very difficult. It was just not easy to fit in. It was not easy to just do normal social interaction with people. And admittedly, that got better over time as my life went on. I got older, more mature, and I was able to deal with it better, but it's not smooth sailing at first. Spectrum Advantage is a program designed to help people on the autistic spectrum gain employment in the workplace. Training for any situation that you would find as being on the spectrum. Things that would be difficult for people on the spectrum to accomplish. First days were full of anxiety. I just felt so scared, so intimidated. I didn't even know if I was going to be able to do it.
So we got involved with Spectrum Advantage in November. We were approached by one of the directors. We've had some really great success in the past with work experience students. The first few days while Nick was here at the store, it wasn't tough. It was just like having any other new associate in the store with us, where we took him aside, showed him the ropes, walked the store.
It takes longer for me to learn things than, say, your typical person. Sometimes I have to ask again and again how to do something. And that's just part of it. Eventually, though, people on the spectrum can learn. And if they have enough practice, they can, even difficult things can be accomplished. It's going to be an Australian Labradoodle.
Really? They're beautiful.
What I've learned from Nick as being his boss is to slow down a lot, and that's a good thing for my performance as well. People learn in different capacities, so he may learn in another way. I may learn visually, where he might be non-visual.
I really like that you can just back up all your files so easily.
We were out on the floor, my GM and I, and we were talking about his opportunities and what he's brought to the table for us. And so Nick came over, and Marty, our GM, said, "Nick, you're doing a fabulous job here at Staples. How would you like to come on board as a paid employee with Staples?" He got so excited, it was amazing, and he said yes immediately.
One misconception that people might have is that people with autism are unintelligent, which is totally not the case. People with autism have a variety of intellectual levels, and many of them are capable of doing many things just like everyone else. Total is $563.46.
Other companies should really get involved with this because it's a mutual benefit. We benefit from Nick, and Nick benefits from us. So really it's beneficial for everybody.
It did make a difference. It really gave me the confidence that, hey, I can actually go out, get back into the workplace.
So we were getting the iTunes gift card.
I just want to learn as much as I can, gain as much experience as possible. But if my career takes me toward a place where I can help more people, then I'm all for it. Here you are.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. I just wanted to share with you some referral resources in the city of Calgary. And so for individuals living on the autism spectrum who are looking for employment, you can contact Spectrum Advantage, located in the Ability Hub. And if you are representing a company that is looking for help accommodating your employee on the autism spectrum, Next Level ASD Consulting really helps companies and HR departments set individuals up for employment success. So thank you very much for your time.